In a world that's growing increasingly pluralistic and secularized, is it still possible to have civil and fruitful conversations between Christians and non-Christians? Broadcaster Justin Brierley is here to offer us a way forward. For nearly 2 decades, Justin has hosted hundreds of high-profile debates between Christians, atheists, and agnostics on the internationally renowned radio show and podcast called Unbelievable. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you so much for having me, Walter. It's great to be with you.
Justin, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you would even come up with a show called Unbelievable.
Well, Unbelievable really came out of the fact that I had been working at that time, this was going all the way back to 2005, in Christian radio. That was where I started my journalistic career. And I really enjoyed the fact that we were doing an important service of bringing Christian content to Christians in the UK who are very often underserved actually by the media, and encouraging them and helping them to sort of, understand and think through their faith. But what we weren't really modeling was how to have good conversations with our non-Christian friends and neighbors. And those were the people that you were usually always alongside you, especially in a very secular culture like the UK. And so I just felt that it was the right thing to challenge, what was then just a radio audience with some conversations on air with people who didn't share their faith. And we could bring in hopefully good Christian communicators who would model what a good conversation looks like. And that was really how Unbelievable was born. And I suppose the title was a little bit tongue in cheek. It was saying, are the claims of Christianity unbelievable? It had a question mark at the end. And to that extent, I discovered actually in the course of hosting those conversations over what amounted to actually over 17 years in the end of hosting the show, that actually Christianity is not unbelievable. In fact, it can make an awful lot of sense. But one of the best ways of getting to the core of it and its claims and having those is by having these conversations, these sort of open-ended conversations. Because those conversations, it turned out, were not just helpful for Christians, but for a lot of non-Christians who ended up listening to the show. Once we started podcasting the show, we suddenly had a lot of non-Christians who started to pick it up. And then obviously we moved to video as well, and another audience joined us. And I was always delighted that it was a genuinely, in that sense, bipartisan audience of both Christians and skeptics and seekers who were engaging in these conversations. And that for me was an enormous privilege to be hosting conversations that had such a wide variety of listeners. And in a way that it became even more important at that point to host and moderate those conversations well for the benefit of everyone who was listening.
In hindsight, it seems compelling and obvious because you've seen the fruit of that. But at the start of it, I imagined there might have been some pushback on why wouldn't you just equip the church to have these conversations? Why enter into what seemed like the risky business of conversations that could blow up? I mean, what if an atheist wins the conversation, so to speak? How did you navigate? What were some of the initial reactions to the way in which you were going about this?
You're absolutely right. That was one of the responses that came in. There were some listeners who were very uncomfortable with the whole idea and said, we've got plenty of atheists on the BBC. Do we need to have them on our Christian radio station? And I understood that complaint. At the same time, I felt actually to be a Christian in, a very post-Christian secular Britain, you have to be willing to hear other points of view. There's no point trying to build a Christian bubble. It doesn't really exist anymore anyway in the UK. And I would rather that actually Christians were exposed to arguments against their faith from people in a context where they're at least hearing a good Christian response. And for me, that was important to always obviously have both perspectives well matched and brought onto the show. And obviously there were some people who didn't want that, and they learned, I guess, to just skip that particular segment in the afternoon when the show was on. But actually I discovered far many more Christians who did want it, who actually said, yeah, we need this content. I want to be shown what an actual conversation looks like. Now that's not to say there isn't an important place for some of that, more, if you like, straightforward kind of apologetic kind of information that you can deliver through a program or an article or a resource. That's all fine. The problem is that in real life, when you actually go out and start to talk to people, it's a different thing. There's someone on the other end of the conversation, and it's actually more than simply delivering information about why we can trust in Christianity and so on. The show was actually about how to have the conversations as well. And for me, that was perhaps the most important thing people on both sides took away, was actually how to do the conversation, regardless of what information you may have to present, what kind of points in favor or against Christianity you may have. So for me, there was something really profound actually in the end about making sure that these were two points of view that were being brought together in this way.
You had undoubtedly a vision for what you were doing, aspirations, but you noted that oftentimes things in real life are different. You could read a book, but then you actually have a conversation with a flesh and blood person who has emotions and thoughts, and you're navigating all of this. In the course of your 17 years of doing this, what have been some of the surprises to you in the unfolding of actual real conversations with real people?
I think very often it's that when you actually meet someone in real life, they aren't at all necessarily the same as the persona they sometimes project, say, as an online avatar or from behind, a book or a video screen or whatever. Very often, really, it's only in kind of having a down-to-earth conversation with someone that you sort of see the human side of them. You don't just see the fact that they're an atheist who appears to be anti the Christian religion or whatever, or that they're not just a Christian apologist. They have a life, they have a family, they have other interests, they have passions and things going on behind the scenes. So it was always really helpful in a sense to humanize the people. And I think that's one of the major issues, in today's world, is a lot of people are having conversations, but they're not conversations with the full person, because you only see one small slice of that person if you're interacting with, them on a social media profile. And in my experience, you often get very poor results from those kinds of conversations, because it's only when you've got someone sitting in front of you and who you can actually interact with as a human that you fully kind of understand where they're coming from, why they may have a real problem with Christianity. But if you're actually talking to them about it, and you're probably far more likely to understand some of the factors that went into that antipathy towards faith. You're far more likely to actually get behind some of the intellectual objections if you're having a genuine conversation with someone. So for me, that was one of the important things. One example that I remember of this was years ago having an atheist called Alom Shahar on the show, and he had written a book called The Young Atheist Handbook, and it was pretty dismissive of religion. And I was kind of anticipating, when I brought him on for a conversation on the problem of suffering, that we'd have a kind of pretty combative debate on our hands in many ways. But it was actually very different, because when he came on, he was very open actually about his own background, having been brought up in Islam, but sort of rejecting it by his late teens. But actually having had some very, helpful Christians around him, actually Christian influences on his life, it turned out, and talking in very personal terms about the loss of his mother and the way that contributed to his sense of the pain of life and why he struggled with the problem of suffering. And suddenly this, what I expected to be quite a combative sort of, atheist versus Christian debate, as it were, actually was something altogether different, and just involved a lot of humanity. And so you can never entirely tell just from reading someone or interacting with their online sort of persona what the conversation might be if you actually were to sit down and just talk more casually at length, get behind the person's story and so on. And so that was just one example where I was actually really surprised at the way the conversation turned out.
Justin, that's what people bring into that, the desire to connect and to humanize one another. But it actually takes some skill to create an environment, the conditions necessary for that civil conversation. So in your experience, how did you manage to keep conversations civil when the potential for it to become really spicy is always just around the corner? Are there a couple of principles that guide you in managing conversations, keeping them civil so we can get to the humanizing part of it?
Well, I will say up front that sometimes I didn't do a great job of managing to keep the conversation civil. And there were some episodes which kind of went a bit off the rails because I guess I had selected two people who were bound to kind of spark off each other. And to some extent, that's probably the first principle is you kind of get out what you put in. If you are putting in two characters, for instance, in a dialogue who you know are going to be combative, abrasive, dismissive of each other, then you can kind of know what to expect as the outcome. You're probably going to have a lot of heat and fury, but potentially not much light shone on the subject. And that has happened. Now, there's nothing wrong with a bit of drama. You know, you don't want things to be so sort of friendly that you know, we're all falling asleep because we're all desperate to agree with each other the whole time. You want to have obviously a point of contention. You want to have perhaps even a little bit of drama along the way. But I think my job as the host was to try and make sure that however much there was a difference of opinion in the studio or on the Zoom call or whatever, that actually we didn't get bogged down, firstly, in issues. There was a kind of a point at which I needed to move us along if we'd kind of maybe talked around a subject and it was evident we'd reached an impasse and there was not much point in continuing to go over the same points, just to help, you know, to perhaps move it into a more fruitful area of conversation. It was always helpful, you know, from the outset to where there were points of commonality to put those on the table as well, to kind of make sure both guests addressed each other civilly from the outset and kind of, you know, had something good to say about each other, what they did. For instance, if it's someone responding to someone's book, the things they could agree to, but then moving on perhaps into the things they disagreed with. So I think all of those are helpful. And I think one of the things I always tried to do as well, for the sake of the audience as much as anything, was to represent each guest hopefully as charitably as possible in the way I reframed or kind of summarized some of their arguments. So very often I saw my job as perhaps someone had just sort of spent 5 or 10 minutes sort of laying out some, you know, quite nuanced sort of case for or against God or around some piece of theology. And I would then try to summarize that as helpfully as I could before handing it to the other guests to sort of respond to. And that was partly for the sake of the audience. And I think there's an important principle there about being charitable. You know, even if I disagreed with that person's perspective, I wasn't going to sort of hopefully, you know, turn it into a straw man for the other person. You know, I think there's a good, you know, people talk these days about steel manning someone's argument. So even if you disagree with them, you do your best to present it as strongly as possible, as compellingly as possible, so that we can at least, you know, both be on the same page about what we're actually disagreeing about. And I think there's a place for that. So there were just a number of things that I think helped to ensure that people felt they were being heard. I think probably discussions and debates tend to break down the most when it feels like there are there's no civility, that you're not being heard for what you said, you're being misinterpreted constantly. And I think that having someone who is a moderator who kind of knows how to keep a handle on those things is very helpful in those kinds of circumstances, and who can just occasionally also just, you know, just puncture the atmosphere slightly if things are getting a bit heated, or you know, just a little aside or a joke or something to just lighten the atmosphere also can help a lot, and just help people to realize, you know, I don't need to take myself quite so seriously, sort of thing. So so all of those were, I think, things I learned along the way as I tried to host these conversations in that way.
Yeah, it seems like these are some really basic skills of like marriage counseling, of being able to listen well, ask questions, redirect, get to the heart of the issue, but also to restate things in order to let your, you know, partner in life really know that they have been thoroughly heard and understood on their own terms. I think that's really a compelling way of describing it. I like how you started it, that oftentimes we are drawn to try to respond to the most contentious, inflammatory personalities. But that's not always going to be fruitful. In fact, there's like this whole middle, the groups of people with the diversity of experiences that just need to be engaged and given some space for conversation. But we're somehow drawn, you know, like moths to a light, to to the lightning personality, to the someone that's just demanding for a rebuttal, and it's producing nothing but anger on our own part as we seek to rebut that. So there's kind of a wisdom, what you're trying to say, of how do we have conversations?
Yeah, and I think as I say, when I started the show, this was before really social media had really come on the scene, before there were all these ways to sort of have these online kinds of conversations and debates. But as those things started to appear and became more and more significant in the way that they shaped the narrative in our culture and the way they influenced people, I began to realize just how important it was to model these face-to-face conversations, long-form conversations where it was more than just a soundbite and where you were genuinely having that kind of human interaction, because the anonymity, of the online world is firstly a problem, because you're not seeing, as I say, the full person who actually is behind that idea that you perhaps disagree with. But equally, it's in the nature of the social media platforms that they tend to thrive on the polarization they generate, and inevitably you tend to end up hearing the most from the extremes, and those exist, but they don't always obviously represent the majority of people, and yet we tend to hear from them the most because that's the way the algorithms tend to generate the most views. Put the most outrageous sort of ends of the spectrum on, and you'll generate the most heat and the most number of responses and everything else. And sadly, it's a huge temptation in media to do that. And there were lots of times when I sort of had to resist that urge to kind of put on the most inflammatory voices because I knew they would generate the most views and the most clicks and everything. Because actually you're just sort of feeding into that feedback loop at that point. And I think there is a sort of a moral responsibility, especially for Christians, to fairly represent actually what is actually happening in the culture and the views that are there. And it's not always going to be this far right or this far left. Most people actually exist somewhere in the middle. And that may not be quite as exciting or generate as many ratings, but actually that's where I think we need to have more conversations, because that's where most people actually often dwell most of the time. And it can make people, I think, feel that it gives us a really false sense, actually, I think, of what's happening. There's that phrase that, of sometimes we just need to get off Twitter or X as it now is, and spend some time in the real world. Because if you just spent all your time there, you'd think that the world was on fire constantly. And it's not. If you just go and just spend a week without any of that stuff, you realize, it's a bit more normal than I realized. That not everything is a disaster, sort of thing. So I just think we need to be really careful of the way that social media, especially these days, sort of changes our perception of the world, because of what it delivers us in that way.
Yeah, in that regard, social media is formative. It's morally and socially formative. These algorithms are not just dispassionate ways in which to increase revenue, that they actually have this formative impact on us. And you're seeking to, in the long form, complex, humanizing, question asking, restating, you're doing some moral and social formation in that. Now I want to ask the question in the flip side. So these are the ingredients that you're hoping to foster, conditions you're hoping to set for good civil conversation to be modeled. On the flip side, what have you discovered are the ingredients and conditions that cause conversations to fall apart?
I think there's probably a few ingredients that cause conversations to fall apart. I think one of them is when I brought on two perspectives that are incredibly emotionally engaged at some level with their subject matter. And so the memory that's coming to mind really is when and this is always going to be a hot button issue, but I did a debate, hosted a debate on sexuality. And there have been lots of debates I've done which have been very good, people with different perspectives on those issues, often two Christians with different perspectives, but have still been cordial and a good outcome in terms of, being able to hear each other and so on. This one was the counter to that. It degenerated very quickly into some very passionate language and sort of a real sense that there was a really bad atmosphere in the studio as I was recording it. And I think it was because, you know, and this is on me to some extent, I'd brought in people who probably were so emotionally engaged and attached to the issues that they weren't willing to sort of see or listen to the other person's perspective. And I think, and there's nothing wrong, obviously, with being emotionally engaged with the issues, but when it sort of, it blinds you to being able to have a civil conversation on the issue, being able to sort of look at the issue somewhat dispassionately, I think that's going to be a problem, and it'll quickly degenerate into name calling and accusations and everything else. So there's something about, as I say, being able to host conversations with people who, yes, are invested in these issues, but who do not see them in that sense as overcoming any sense of the humanity of the other person, who don't see these issues as more important, if you like, than loving the person in front of you, and having, you know, a conversation that's fruitful in that way. So there's something about that that I think needs to be said. I think as well, another way in which you can really make sure a conversation goes in the wrong direction is by not giving people enough time to state their case. And that, again, is one of the problems with a lot of media these days, is everything is done in sound bites, and it's very difficult really to understand the complexity and nuance of an argument. If you're only giving someone 30 seconds to state their argument, they inevitably will end up, you know, taking shortcuts, mischaracterizing, and so on. And that's where I think that you know, again, one of the strengths of the shows I was able to host was that we gave hopefully enough time, you know, for people to spell out their case and feel like they could have a genuine dialogue back and forth and a conversation where both sides are heard. And I think another kind of way in which conversations can often be derailed is if the moderator, assuming there is a moderator, is themselves too partisan. And there are obviously going to have been times when I was hosting conversations when I certainly took one or other side, you know, personally, but I tried to do my best to make each guest feel that they were being represented well. And I did sort of apologize if ever I sort of came in too much on the side of one or the other, because perhaps of my own personal differences. I often was contacted, you know, over the years that I was hosting the Unbelievable Show, by listeners who said, I don't understand how you could keep your calm when that person was saying this, you know, I would have. But I think you have to. I think you have to trust that you've brought in two people who are going to speak for themselves. You don't have to do it for them. And the chips will fall where they will fall. You know, these were not conversations that had been gerrymandered in order for one side to win. They were genuinely open conversations. And as you said near the beginning, it's not like the Christian guest won every time. Sometimes the atheist might sort of come out looking best, you know. And that was part of both the challenge of it and the danger, if you like. But it was also kind of the fact that it made it real, you know, because in real life, conversations are like that. You don't always win every conversation. What I did experience was that, in fact, the atheists and agnostics who listened to the show, they really appreciated the fact that actually there was a kind of sense in which it wasn't just sort of always, you know, skewed in favor of the Christian in that way. They felt, no, this was a genuine meeting of minds. And actually that, I think, had a lot more impact in the end, actually, than simply them being fed a sort of a sense that, oh, this is just in setting up a kind of easy win for the Christians or anything like that. So I think it's really important for the moderator to try and be genuinely as neutral as they can be, despite the natural biases we all have, because I think both sides will benefit from that, and the listeners will benefit from that. The people watching will benefit if they don't feel that they're kind of being given a skewed set of facts. Again, this could relate, I suppose, to the fact that so much of our news media does inevitably come from an ideological basis now, and if you're watching on CNN versus Fox or whatever, you're going to get a certain version of the events, and none of us are sort of neutral sort of commentators in that sense. But I think it is really important to try as best we can to let the facts speak for themselves, to let people speak for themselves, and to sort of let people make their own mind up in the end. It's not your job to kind of speak for the guests or try to gerrymander the conversation. Let's try to give an opportunity for people to make their best case, and then the audience can make their mind up.
Justin, I get deeply the sense that you're not simply trying to model good conversation for conversation's sake or just to tickle our imaginations, but there is truth out there. There are issues that are of critical importance. In hosting these kinds of healthy dialogues, did you witness people actually change their minds? Did you see folks move in directions of saying, this, you've made a really good point, and I've been so dignified in the way that I've been treated. I think you may have persuaded me for the first time to consider a different view of things.
Well, certainly within the hour or so of the conversation, if we're talking about the guests on the show, you rarely had someone completely change their mind. You were generally bringing on people who had a very specific opinion on something, and so 1 hour of conversation was unlikely to change that. I think what often did change in the course of conversations, though, even with guests, was an atheist guest, say, who came on, who was a little bit maybe wary of this idea of coming on to a Christian talk show to kind of discuss these ideas. They might go away with a bit of a better opinion, actually, of Christians, because they'd had a good experience. They hadn't felt like they'd been preached to or entrapped or anything like that. They'd actually had a good conversation. And so to that extent, it often I saw some of the barriers coming down a little bit, some of the assumptions about what this would be being changed. And likewise for Christian guests, very often I think that also existed. They appreciated the fact that it was such a good conversation with an atheist, whereas they might not have had that experience before. So I think that was a good result in the sense, regardless of whether anyone changed their mind on the subjects. Obviously, the people who really were making their mind up and open to changing their mind were more often the listeners, and so that was where you would see significant changes over time. Again, very rarely was it one conversation that would change someone's mind necessarily, though that could happen. More often, I was often being contacted by people who saying, well, I've been listening for a year or 2 years or 3 years, Justin, and I started this, listening as a hardened skeptic atheist, and now I'm a kind of interested agnostic. That might be the amount they'd moved, because they'd actually heard enough to make them realize that some of their presuppositions about Christianity had perhaps just been, false assumptions, perhaps read more off the media than what's in reality. So often I would see movement of that kind. And sometimes, yeah, absolutely, I would see people who came to faith, not just because of the Unbelievable show, but often other factors that were going on in their lives. But I now work with someone, a young guy called Peter Byram, who I first bumped into when he started listening to the Unbelievable show, and he was an atheist at the time. But it was the nature of the conversations that really helped him to start to rethink things. And then he started to go out and look for other similar, material, and started engaging not just with the atheists that he had been reading, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, but with some great Christian thinkers and apologists. And over time, it was the course of several years, he was able to come to faith, and it was obviously transformative for him. So those stories happened and continue to happen. The thing to say is, in the end, I've got relatively little control over that. It really is in God's hands. And there's a sort of sense in which all I can do is hopefully faithfully try to do what I feel I'm being called to, make sure both sides are heard well, that I try and bring the best of both positions together. And then I believe God's working in the background. Now, it's not always a simple picture of people coming to faith. There may be atheists, skeptics who listen, who it only confirms, their kind of view that Christianity doesn't make sense, and You can't kind of control the direction of travel in that sense. This is an open thing. But I know enough people for whom it has been significant to know that actually this is important. Having these open conversations does make a difference to many people and their willingness to listen. I think that the big difference for me is that many of them would never have started to even engage the possibility of Christianity had it not been done in this style where we're open to hearing different perspectives. They would have just felt they were being sold, being sold a used car by a salesman if it was just a Christian perspective that was being represented. They would have had no reason to really even start listening. But when they came across the show because another atheist had recommended it to them, or some well-known atheist that they follow had been on the show and posted it to their social media, or whatever it was, there were all kinds of ways in which agnostics and skeptics started to listen. It was surprised that was their way in, and that was probably the only way they would have ever been exposed to a genuine, thoughtful Christian perspective. And so I'm really glad that we were able to have that kind of conversation, which kind of gave a sort of an opening, an invitation for people to come and hear. And they weren't necessarily all persuaded, but some of them were along the way.
It's such a compelling example that the kind of persuasion that you're talking about and moving someone from a hardened atheist to, an inquiring, interested agnostic to someone who actually, as you've shared, come to faith and are now laboring in these kinds of contexts of conversation. This is what every Christian would ultimately desire in persuading others because of the love of Jesus to come to faith. And yet that so frequently goes sideways. I think about, an experience that I had early on in my career in ministry. I was a campus chaplain at Yale University, and we had invited a speaker to give an evangelistic talk. And in the course of the talk, we had invited a lot of students, non-Christian students, very thoughtful people who, by showing up to this talk, signaled their openness. I mean, why else would you come at this university to a talk about Christianity if you had not at least had a relationship that you found compelling, friendship that you trusted, or were intellectually curious, or just had some gnawing sense of desire? And the speaker proceeded to insult those who weren't Christians and called them cabbage heads. Wow. For not believing that the Bible was the inspired word of God. And that was fairly traumatizing to me as a campus chaplain trying to bear witness to Christ. And yet on the flip side, I can say that there were innumerable conversations that I had that were lovely, earnest, honest conversations when people were given the dignity of space and time, friendship that permitted dialogue, and that dialogue that eventually led to really probing, challenging questions. But it was in the context of this, as we've been talking about, this kind of humanizing others, as well as dealing with the complexity of the issues and coming to points of just saying, that's a good question. I don't have an answer to that. I may have answers that I find sufficient and compelling, but that's one that I haven't gotten to yet. And just acknowledging that with humility. Yeah. Why is it so easy just to devolve to the cabbage head approach to persuasion? And why is it so difficult to persist in this other route that may, in fact, never immediately bear fruit, but you testify it does bear fruit?
I think it's because we live in a culture where so often we are presented with some idea that if we haven't won the argument, then we've lost, and that's the great danger in Christianity, apologetics, evangelism, is to sort of think that we have to have sort of effectively have trounced the opposition in order for us to have been successful. And there's this old saying, it's a bit hackneyed now, but I think it bears truth that you can win an argument but lose a person, and that's always the problem. You can go in with a lot of, steaming in with really unassailable arguments, or, insults, even calling people cabbage heads. And you may think you've won, but you've actually lost, because you lost the person in the process. And I mean, it goes without saying that for me, the obvious scripture that comes to mind is 1 Peter 3:15. Always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you about the reason for the hope that you have. But we often forget the end of that, don't we? Which is, but do this with gentleness and respect. And for me, so often the way we put the case for faith is just as important as the things we say, the arguments we make. And if we do it in a spirit of condescension or being patronizing or dismissive, then the reasons we give will never land, because someone wants to have what you have at the end of the day. You have to, if the real question often going through someone's mind is, do I want to be like this person if this is what I'm being offered? And if what they see is a cantankerous, obstreperous, dismissive person, they're far less likely, I think, to be persuaded by your arguments. If they find someone who is open, kind, courteous, gracious, respectful, that you've got a much better chance, if you like, of your arguments landing, and so on. And I just think it's absolutely important to do what you said, to have intellectual humility, to realize that we're not the fount of knowledge. There's been lots of occasions over the years when I've perhaps been in not just in the moderator's chair, but sat perhaps representing Christian faith, and I've probably oversold what my abilities, how much I actually know about a subject. And I soon find myself backpedaling quickly, because I can easily get out of my depth. And I think it's just important to own up to your limits of your knowledge. If you don't know something, don't pretend that you do, but say, well, I'd love to look into that and come back, let's have another conversation. Keep the door open to another conversation. And I think in the end, people will respect you far more for admitting the limits of your knowledge, to having some humility, than if you try to pretend that you know things you don't. So all of those, I think, are important principles, and actually they make for much better conversations in the end. I don't ever expect, I think, anyone to change their mind on the basis of one conversation. But if you leave the door open for further conversations, if you haven't closed down that possibility by scaring them off or insulting them, then you may just find that actually there is a change of mind that happens, as you hopefully conduct those conversations with the kind of grace and respect and gentleness that Scripture enjoins us to.
You've written a book recently, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. You've also engaged in conversations, debates with leading atheists, Alex O'Connor being an example of that. I mean, what are you discovering, both in the books and in the conversations that you're having, where you are engaging in a defense of the Christian faith and this art of persuasion? What are you discovering about maybe this rebirth of belief, as you describe it?
Well, I mean, what the book really describes is a real change in the tone of the conversation, because when I began the Unbelievable show, it was, this quite combative atmosphere that I was walking into. These sort of very demonstrative new atheists claiming that God was a delusion, that religion was bad for you. Atheist bus campaigns in London bearing the slogan, "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life." So a lot of the conversations inevitably took on that tone of being quite combative and dramatic in that way, and quite polarized in many ways. But what I was really glad to see over time was actually that very sort of dogmatic form of atheism started to wane. I think people kind of got tired of it eventually. I think a lot of people realized it didn't have all the answers it claimed to have in terms of science and reason, that you need more than those things to make sense of life. And there's a whole interesting story I go into some depth in the book and my podcast series about the sort of internal fractures that occurred within the new atheist movement, as a lot of them began to disagree with each other far more than they ever disagreed with their Christian counterparts. But what I noticed coming in the place of that sort of very aggressive, dogmatic sort of conversation around God was a far more open conversation, a more nuanced one from secular thinkers still, but who were far more open to the value of faith, sympathetic to what Christianity has done for the West. This could include people like the historian Tom Holland, for instance, here in the UK, who has a huge platform, co-hosts one of the most listened to history podcasts in the world. But in his best-selling book, Dominion, really lays out the way in which he believes actually at a historical level, the moral instincts of the West have absolutely been shaped by the Christian Revolution. And seeing so many people now turning to speakers like him, thinkers like him, and away from these very sort of dismissive atheists of the new atheist type, Dawkins and so on. And even among that set of thinkers, a real kind of change coming over them. I think a lot of those folk who kind of were trying to get rid of religion, believing that it was superstition and that we needed to replace it with an era of science and reason, I think they've come to realize actually we're all inherently religious. You can't sort of squash the religion out of people. It just manifests in different forms, and people become religious about political ideologies or gender ideologies or anything, on the left and the right. And I think even Richard Dawkins, in more recent years has mellowed a lot when it comes to his critiques of institutional religion, because he's realized we're all religious, in some level or other. And when he's having far fiercer debates with his fellow secularists over things like transgender, I think he's come to realize, it turns out we've all got our kind of sacred things in life and so on. So I've just noticed a real change in the tone of the conversation. Many more people being more open to the positive value of faith, the way in which it has shaped positively the world, and just opening up to taking it seriously again. And so I've tried to sort of represent that kind of conversation in the book. And there's a podcast documentary series that accompanies it, also called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, where I tell some of the stories of rebirth, some really interesting stories of people who have gone from atheism to Christianity, for instance, but also people who find themselves somewhere in the middle, who are lapsed atheists, but they haven't embraced Christianity yet, but they're dissatisfied with the secular story of reality. And I just find those fascinating conversations to map out. And there's a whole kind of dimension of it that involves the socio-cultural things that are going on in our world at the moment and how they're playing into it. So yeah, it's an interesting time. And I suppose my overall hope with the book and the podcast series is to sound a note of optimism for the church. I think we often get left with the impression that everything's awful and that, everyone's very disillusioned and burned out on religion. But actually, I believe God's doing something new, and there's actually a real opportunity for the church, because there's a meaning crisis in our culture. And I think if we can kind of get our act together, we still have a message that is the most transformational message that ever has existed and ever will. And there are actually a lot of people hungry for it at the moment, and I'm meeting a lot of them all the time.
Justin, you mentioned if we can get our act together. So there's a bit of an irony here that your experience is the divide between, atheism and Christianity is shifted. There's an openness, at least a congeniality, a willingness to converse across these differences. And yet in the church, we're often finding increasing divides along the political spectrum, ideological spectrum. What are you suggesting for us to do, transferring lessons learned from the unbelievable or other podcasts, conversations that you've had between atheists and Christians that we really should be applying in these other spaces as well, along the political divides that have infected the church or society at large? Are there just basic common principles that would apply?
I think there are a lot of transferable principles, and one of them is to humanize the people that we may disagree with. And for me, that's so important, isn't it? Whether it's around a Thanksgiving table, when you're speaking to the uncle who doesn't share your political opinions, or whether it's in a church scenario. I think we need to spend less time in the social media echo chambers and more time genuinely talking to people and understanding, why they're concerned, where their particular political perspective comes from, and trying to get behind that and understand that before simply shouting them down and trying to, put your perspective across. And I think genuinely, when people are heard, they're far more likely, if you do want to try to persuade them of a different way of looking at the world or politics, they're far more likely to take that seriously if they feel like you've actually understood where they're coming from. And I think a lot of the reason why, just from where I'm standing, there has been a swing towards, certain more strong-armed forms of politics that, some Christians are getting behind is often because there are people who don't feel they're being heard, and so they resort to that kind of thing. I think it's a marker of the desperation many people feel that they will resort to, these strong-armed forms of politics when they feel like they don't have an avenue to actually express or be heard. So I think the church can be a place where we do that. If it's anything, the church still has to be a community where people who are different from each other can gather around something that is bigger than any of us, and hopefully have those kinds of conversations with the kind of grace and respect that Jesus models for us. Now, that's extremely difficult in practice, but Christians believe in miracles. I believe it can happen, even in our very polarized culture, that the church can model something different in terms of the way we are willing to talk to people who are different to us. So it's always a tragedy when that sort of polarization infects the church, because the church has to be an antidote to that. It has to be a kind of that grace-filled countercultural example of how to, love your enemies, whether they be political, ideological, or whatever, that actually we insist on not simply demonizing people, but sitting down and actually understanding them. And that's an act of love, to actually sit down and listen to someone and understand them before responding. So that for me is my great hope, that the church can still be that kind of a witness in the world.
Mm. Justin, thank you. This conversation has achieved that hope. I'm deeply hopeful that what you have acquired over the years, hard-fought wisdom in these conversations, really is very hopeful. Thank you, Justin.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on, and blessings on the project as you continue to try and bring people together across the divides.